awaited 2020 Whittington Lecture. I am Maria Conchan, Dean of Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy, and tonight we are very excited to welcome American Enterprise Institute President and mortgage scholar Robert Doar for a conversation near and dear to my wonky heart: solutions to promote happier and healthier policy outcomes for families and communities. In his remarks, Mr. Doar will lay out the argument for the importance of work and steady employment in fighting poverty and promoting socioeconomic mobility. This evening's event will bring out the best of who we are at McCourt and at Georgetown, an opportunity for respectful dialogue about some of the most fiercely debated political and policy issues of our time. Robert and I have had occasion to publicly discuss and debate a number of these issues over the years. While we often disagree, if not on the goals of public policy, then on the best ways to achieve them, I always learn something from Robert's arguments, which reflect lessons learned from his experience running public programs as well as studying them. We host this annual event in honor of Leslie Whittington, an associate dean and an esteemed and accomplished member of our faculty who died tragically on September 11th. As a professor of economics and public finance, Leslie was also passionate about family economic policy issues. While I did not know Leslie, my colleagues have told me she would have had good questions to contribute to today's discussion. Leslie was a beloved member of our community. She is remembered as a first-class educator who championed our students and demanded their best work, and from what I have heard from her students, inspired them in many aspects of their lives. I want to offer a special welcome to Leslie's former students who are with us this evening. After his remarks, I look forward to moderating a discussion with Mr. Doar featuring questions from our students. So please have your questions ready to go and submit them in the Q&A function along with your name and school and degree and graduation year. Robert mentioned to me as we were preparing that he has prepared relatively short remarks to allow for us to have a more robust discussion. So please get your questions ready so that we can have a conversation. We also honor Leslie's memory not only with this lecture, but through a scholarship to a distinguished second-year student. And this event gives me an opportunity to celebrate the academic accomplishments of McCourt alumna, Madeline Pickens, a 2020 graduate of our Data Science and Public Policy program, and our 2020 Whittington Scholar. Maddie was involved with several student organizations during her time at McCourt, including serving as senior data visualization editor for the Georgetown Public Policy Review and the MSDSPP representative on the McCourt Student Association. She also was a board member of Women in Public Policy Initiative. I am delighted to welcome Maddie back to the virtual Hilltop to introduce Mr. Doar. Maddie, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maddie Pickens, and I'm honored to be the 2020 Whittington Scholar. I may have graduated last year, but I'm so grateful to the McCourt School of Public Policy for allowing me to return and be a part of this important event. Even before all the events of last year, my education at McCourt emphasized the role of low-income workers in our economy and the importance of providing safety nets to these workers and their families. If the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us anything, it is that policy going forward must continue to acknowledge the role that employment plays in economic mobility and in fighting poverty. Because of this, I am so excited for the remarks by this year's Whittington lecturer, Mr. Robert Doar. Mr. Doar is the president and mortgage scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. His career spans over 20 years of experience administering social service programs in New York City and New York State, including cash welfare, food assistance, public health insurance, and child support enforcement services. In particular, he expanded access to work support programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. He has received numerous awards for community impact, leadership, and service from a variety of government institutes and bodies. At the American Enterprise Institute, he has served as a lead member of the AEI Brookings Working Group on Poverty and Opportunity and the co-chair of the Bipartisan National Commission on Hunger. He has also contributed to a number of publications focusing on work and economic mobility. It is very apparent to me that Mr. Doar has deep experience and passion for these topics, and I'm so honored to introduce him as this year's Whittington Lecturer.
Well, thank you very much, Maddie and Maria, for that very kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to give the 2020 Whittington Lecture. And congratulations, Maddie, on your achievement of being a Whittington Scholar. I am going to read my remarks, and I was saying to the group beforehand that I'm used to Zoom calls, and I kind of like Zoom calls, but I don't often read remarks on Zoom calls. And so this will be tricky for me, and I hope you will forgive me if I'm looking down and a little distracted. They're relatively brief, but I have an important point I'd like to make, and then I look forward to the dialogue and discussion afterwards. So let me begin. At a recent virtual event sponsored by the Georgetown Dialogue on Poverty, the opening discussion question was, why should we dedicate ourselves to reducing poverty in America? Now, this is a more complicated question than you might think. Some may answer that they want people to have money, that we want to improve well-being, raise incomes, and spread wealth. And others might say that we think it's unfair. Some people should be poor when others have so much. And others still might point to religious or moral imperatives. And while these are all important considerations, they don't fully explain to me the reason why we fight poverty. For me, the reason I've dedicated myself to that fight is because I want all of us, everyone in America, to lead positive and flourishing lives where everyone contributes to their families and their communities in a positive way. In pursuing this objective, we need to constantly recognize that everyone has dignity and everyone has potential. And in fighting poverty, indeed in all that we do, we should celebrate the first and maximize the second. Now, I stress that because I think it's a mistake to focus only on material resources, money and income. Reducing poverty in America needs to be about a lot more than that. So I want to start with this first principle. Why should we fight poverty? Because we want people to have flourishing and positive lives. And to do that, we want to maximize their potential and celebrate their dignity. These priorities are why work is so important. Employment provides an avenue for people to both show their dignity and fulfill their potential. Employment means earning your own success, accomplishing something in partnership with others, learning a skill, venturing out into the larger community, setting an example for your friends, children, and family, contributing to something beyond yourself. Now, to be sure, earnings from work are not always enough to support a family. And that is why we need to use our safety net programs to reward work. In very many cases, earnings and assistance work in combination. And for some time now, our safety net has been based on these priorities. And by nearly all measures, by keeping our system focused on the key pillars of encouraging work and providing assistance, we've been successful in creating a system that cares for the poor and uplifts our most needy. In fact, our work-focused safety net has cut child poverty in the United States significantly since welfare reform in the early 1990s. So how exactly do we reduce poverty? To put things in context, we need to understand how our anti-poverty efforts make a combination of earned income and benefits work together for an individual family. Take, for example, a working single mother with 2 children. Her income from employment is supplemented by numerous safety net programs. Some of these are awarded without work requirements, and some also incentivize her to earn some income. So while she may only earn $13,000 a year in income from full-time minimum wage job, programs such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, Medicaid, and SNAP mean that her total household resources exceeds $40,000 a year, an amount far above the official poverty line for a family of her size. This example represents our current safety net, which is meant to support work and reward employment. And what I am describing here happens all the time in millions of single-parent families all across America in every state in the union. This emphasis on work has had tremendous benefits. Our Earned Income Tax Credit program ensures that low-income working households can receive up to 40 cents from the federal government for every dollar earned. In recent years, almost 25 million low-income working households have received more than $60 billion in this tax credit that rewards and supplements work. And that doesn't take into account the often generous state and local EITC programs, such as the ones we had in New York State and New York City. Research shows that the EITC increases employment rates among single mother families, increases health among mothers and children, and improves academic outcomes for kids. Over the past 20 years, real spending on many components of our safety net have increased significantly. Public health insurance, food assistance, and aid for childcare have all grown dramatically, all of which often supplements and rewards working individuals and families. And all of these efforts have led to a dramatic decline in poverty when it is properly measured. Bruce Meyer of the University of Chicago and James Sullivan of Notre Dame have found that looking at all that low-income families are able to purchase and consume, the poverty rate was just under 3% for all individuals in 2019. Than at any point in our history. The reason that we've experienced this success is that policymakers from both the left and the right have recognized that a strong emphasis on work must be one of the central pillars of our approach. Now, I don't want to minimize the factors that make employment for some people challenging. Sometimes a person might be incapable of work due to debilitating health conditions, or they lack the support such as childcare, reliable transportation, which makes employment possible. And sometimes jobs are scarce, but these are on the importance of work as a path out of poverty. Now consider the alternative presented by something like universal basic income. When the primary goal for a safety net program is to make poverty more comfortable, we decline to use government to help low-income families and communities earn their success. And I fear we shortchange them of a chance for upward mobility. A non-working family might have their material needs met by government-provided income from traditional cash welfare, food aid, and housing assistance, but only employment offers them a realistic path toward a better life. The only way to recognize their dignity and allow them to maximize their potential is by constructing programs that encourage them to correlated with increased upward economic mobility for children. They concluded, quote, evidently, what predicts upward mobility is not proximity to jobs, but growing up around people who have jobs. More generally, work ties people to their communities. My AEI colleague, Nick Eberstadt, has found that men without work spend far more time in front of screens than nearly any other group, averaging over 2,100 hours per year. This malaise harms religious, civic, and volunteering organizations. Perhaps most important, work contributes to a sense of purpose and achievement, allowing people to take pride in their lives. It is this aspect that most strongly contributes to the dignity and fulfillment of work. When President Kennedy toured NASA headquarters in 1962, he came across a custodial argue that the current situation has revealed a crisis that calls for long-lasting changes to our safety net, extending direct payments to out-of-work individuals, expanding child tax credits for non-working families, and reducing the emphasis on existing work-based programs. I believe we are at risk of making a terrible misstep in an effort to address a temporary crisis with long-lasting reforms. We need to address the immediate crisis caused by the pandemic, and I think we have done that to a greater degree than is recognized. But despite this success, Congress recently approved another large stimulus program. And while this program's direct stimulus payments and child tax credits will give workers more money, regardless of whether they work or not, this added aid could hurt them if they drop out of the labor force. As we look forward, I hope that these new initiatives do not have bad unintended consequences. We should be wary of three major concerns. First, we should be concerned that workers may drop out of the labor force. AEI scholars have estimated that female work rates will go down by roughly 4 percentage points. Second, we should be that progress reversed. Fully the expected financial contribution of non-resident fathers and mothers. This worries me because I think it will reduce the financial and emotional contribution of non-resident parents, especially fathers. My AI's colleague, Scott Winship, has recently reviewed the literature, and he concludes that it is reasonable to expect single parent point that has not gotten as much attention, but is something that I think comes from my background as a local and state social services worker, where I spent 20 years working in the social services department of the state and city of New York, where I saw the interaction between individuals seeking assistance and caseworkers attempting to provide them assistance. And we provided an awful lot of assistance to people in need, something we were very proud of. So my third concern is that we So to conclude, we have had success in reducing poverty by encouraging employment. Increasing monthly federal payments to households with children without any connection to employment or the specific circumstances of the family may reduce material hardship. And it certainly will make some policymakers feel as if they have solved a difficult problem. But it also may reduce employment and the benefits that come from work, increase teen pregnancy and substance abuse, and reduce human flourishing. Now, I hope I am wrong about these concerns, but more than 20 years of working
Maddie, the first chance, and our other students. So please.
I would like to say that, the next Whittington lecture, I presume, will be in a field in which the dean is not the foremost national expert on. So I got to feel like I drew a short end of the stick on this one. As much as I love you, Maria, and love Newport School, if you have a foreign policy expert next time, I'm sure it'll be a different situation. But anyway, go ahead, Maddie.
No doubt. And let me just say, as Maddie tees up her question, let me invite other students to enter your questions in the Q&A box so that we can give Robert an opportunity to respond. Maddie.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Robert. That was really interesting. This is a pretty broad question, so feel free to take it in any direction that you'd like. But I think what the McCourt education emphasized really well was that tension between sort of the ideal public policy implementation, so maybe more the research side, and the actual administration of policy programs. And I think your career trajectory speaks really well to that, where you were working in the weeds for so long and now work at this public research institution. So I'm wondering if you see the relationship between sort of policy research and implementation changing in light of the pandemic, or some of these
It's not something that's easily, when you're in an emergency situation, that you can address on a state by state or local level, although we did do a lot of that. And that led to some uncertainty and differences in approach that confused people, and I think was problematic. But that's an emergency, and that desire for a national federal solution fits in that circumstance. I'm a little worried that with the pandemic and with these tremendous changes, big, huge expenditures that Congress is making, not in a period after a major election like in 1964, when LBJ traditionally been a state-federal partnership have been absent from the discussion. And I always felt, though I am in a research institute now, I always felt that my experience of actually running programs, I started out in the child support enforcement program, then I was the deputy commissioner at the state level, then I was the commissioner at the state level. I had SNAP and Medicaid, cash assistance, and programs for people in homeless housing. And then I went to New York and I got even closer to the issues, and I had 14,000 workers. We served 1 million New Yorkers. I always felt to the reality of struggling Americans and the reality of the government's effort to help them, along with others, made me see the world a little different. And so I guess I would just say the last thing. I say to people by the way, when I was at HRA in New York City, or the state office in the state, we recruited from schools like the McCourt School. We do the same thing. So I always like to say to people in your situation coming out of a public policy school, try to get someplace where you're implementing something, when you're actually doing a program. There'll be time for research and coming to Washington, looking at the big picture. But really, it's important to have that direct, granular experience. And I am a little worried about ideas that, the new program that we're talking about is a check that will just show up in people's accounts or in their mailboxes every month. And there's no application process.
The fertility impact of, for example, AFDC or welfare payments?
Well, my interpretation of those studies may not be quite the same as yours. We did a study in HRA in the wake of welfare reform that showed that recipients on public assistance, that is cash welfare, we're much less likely to have an additional child in the years after welfare reform than before welfare reform. So I do think that instituting in the post-welfare reform period a greater emphasis on work and not entitlement to cash benefits led to people thinking more carefully. There is the availability of contraception. There is the availability of public health insurance that makes the availability of contraceptive greater. There is I think there's been a kind of cultural shift about an understanding in a way that there may not have been in the 70s and 80s, that two parents are really important to the successful raising of children. And two parents that are together, ready to commit to that raising of the child together, have greater likelihood of succeeding and having their children prosper and do well. So I think that all could lead to there not being any effect at all. I think it's possible, but it does concern me because it concerns me because people are being given a benefit because of the number of children they have and because they have children. And in neighborhoods, in communities, in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, where I come from, it will be
regular income as very positive. That's maybe where you and I disagree, right? And I think it might have an impact on people's sense of security and ability to attend to their families. So that's, but I want to move into it.
And I will not point about it because you raised this up. I completely acknowledge that in many families this could work really well. But I'm worried about them too. But I do feel that we ought to be conscious of the way it will really play out. And so
I want to, you and I have talked about this in other contexts. So you had fair warning. You knew I would ask you this question.
Well, fair warning.
So one of the things, you have talked about is the child tax credit, and you've kind of compared it implicitly or explicitly to welfare payments. Disincentive, and we have pretty strong evidence that undercut the child support program. So I will just say that from my standpoint, one of the real advantages of the child tax credit is that it doesn't depend on how much you work. And so on the one hand, it's not like the EITC that requires employment, but on the other hand, it doesn't discourage employment because you get that help with the costs of raising a child, and you would get it regardless of whether you also received child support or whether you also were employed. So I see it as solving, you kind of teed up three problems, discouraging work. We've talked about having, the impact on teen pregnancy, and then you also mentioned child support. But isn't there kind of an argument that maybe the child tax credit is a good way to approach supporting families?
Yeah, well, we've discussed this, and there are two effects involving income, and I'm not an economist, and I'm not very good at describing the two effects. And one certainly is the marginal tax rate effect. Is if you earn more money, then your benefits will be declined. Sometimes we have in means-tested programs, we reduce benefits as people's income goes up, and that has a disincentive effect on work, and I acknowledge that. I've acknowledged that for a long time. That's why I, have pursued policies that locked in food stamp benefits or guaranteed Medicaid receipt after someone got a job, regardless of their income. So I get that. But there's also an income effect. There's also the fact that if someone has a situation package of benefits for non-work, the less likely people receiving those benefits would go to work. So maybe you're right. I obviously hope you are. We're going to experiment with this program a little bit this year. It's going to be barely enough time to evaluate the results, and people will push to expand it. But we'll see. I mean, what I've been noticing about the public debate is that my concern has been barely recognized while we've rushed forward to make a very big change to the safety net.
So what feels like a rush to you feels like finally to me, but
Maria,
understood. We have a question.
Do you not agree that we have made some progress in increasing income for low-income families over the past 30 years?
I think we've made some progress. I think it's uneven, and I'm particularly disappointed. I would have expected things to be better. I'm surprised at the lack of mobility. So, part of your argument was that getting people into work would lead, and I'm really quite disappointed in how few people, entered into low-wage employment and are still in low-wage employment. And I think that's a
very legitimate. I've been
challenge.
Disappointed by that too, but I also think I'm a little worried that giving up on work is not the answer to do that. But I do acknowledge that the lack of mobility, I think I've always felt was the next terrain. Let's work on that. I don't know that a cash benefit from Washington is the way to make that happen for everybody, but we'll see.
Well, we could debate this point for a very long time, but we'll be saved by a student who has asked. So Ashley Begley, who is a McCourt School alumna, asks, what are your thoughts on how to solve the childcare issues, both cost, availability, et cetera, that many lower income families face? Also middle income families.
Well, let me say one, there is a silver lining in the child tax credit, which I want to acknowledge, and that is that additional resources provided without restrictions to low-income families with children will allow them greater options to pursue for childcare and education. I think that, I will be saying to people in struggling communities all across America that this benefit should be used to help your children escape failed public schools, or it should be used to help you be able to explore other options to get a better education for your children. So that see fit to educate and help and support their children is a good thing. I should also point out, I think it will be used. The child care block grant. Notably, it was increased in the Trump administration quite significantly. So I support that. I'm a little nervous about restricting choices for parents. So in New York City, when we had the opportunity to provide options for parents so they could use their child care voucher to reimburse their mother or their aunt or their uncle or their friend who was providing childcare, I always generally supported that as opposed to forcing people into state prescribed or state credited childcare facilities. Those costs of those childcare was so great that you ended up limiting the number of people that could get childcare assistance. So I'm a little concerned about that. But I've never, as I mentioned in my remarks, and I have a long history of advocating for additional dollars for childcare. Certainly in That's why I've always been a big supporter of programs to involve the other parent, because I think children that have the benefit of loving parents, two parents, do better. And so to the extent that the dollars allow people to have that greater support, that would be a good thing.
Thank you. The next question comes from Christina Topin, who asks, what are your thoughts on the preliminary findings from the Stockton, California Guaranteed Basic Income pilot that participants actually experienced better employment outcomes versus the control group, i.e. those who did not receive basic incomes, notably unattached from work requirements? So,
the lack of a marginal tax rate may have an effect on keeping people in work. I recognize that. I think the study in Stockton, I want to confess to something. I was the commissioner of social services in New York City for 7 years. Before that, I was commissioner in New York State. I then was the head of the poverty studies program at AEI. But for the last 2 years, I've been the president of AEI. And so I'm not as deep into the details of poverty policies as I used to be. So I haven't read the Stockton report. I do caution everyone in the business generally to be very careful. Studies are important, evaluations are important, controlled examinations are important, but small results and then making them into a big finding that this will certainly happen when we go big time is a real stretch. And I often think in the world of poverty policy, sometimes small effects are made to sound bigger and more significant than they really are. I tend to look, and this is where I may differ from more academic researchers. I tend macro effects on low-income Americans. Did communities get stronger? Did business development increase? Those sorts of things. Studies are great, and I use them too, but I would caution people who are in this community that pretty strong finding that extending unemployment benefits into 99 weeks or extended periods dampen the return to work and labor force participation of Americans. I can remember when I first came to AEI, there was a big debate in Washington about sort of the tail end of the first 4 years of the recovery from the Great Recession of whether we should stop extending unemployment benefits. And there was some dispute about it, and then we did. And work rates went up pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. So I don't think there's any question. And you can't, that extending unemployment benefits, more generous unemployment benefits, make it harder to persuade people to come back to work, period.
So Robert, I want to ask a related question, which is, you didn't talk about minimum wage, but it is, I think, related here because we're talking about kind of ways of supporting employment. And I will say that, you know, I do believe in my experience that there are people who are not able to hold saying you're advocating for this, but there's the kind of make people desperate so they'll take any job mode. And there's and you're not advocating for that, but there's like make work feasible and possible and good. I believe that if something's really good for people and you make it a feasible choice, they will. I'm an economist, so I believe they'll make the right choice. So how do you think about the minimum wage and providing kind of more of an incentive for people to engage in employment?
So first of all, I like higher wages. Don't get me wrong. I want wages to rise. I want wages to rise at the entry-level positions. But I do think about it in two ways. One, like you, I have worked with people who really struggle, people who are coming home from prison, people who have limited education, people who've had difficulties with drug, substance abuse, and mental illness. And I worry that higher minimum wages make it less likely that employers will hire them. And I think evidence shows that that's true. So when we raise minimum wages and workers and employers just say, I can't afford to take a chance on someone, they won't. And that hurts the people who struggle the most. So, and I think there's a lot of evidence that there is job loss when wages are mandated minimum wages are raised. So I'm uncomfortable with that. The second thing is, you know, I did an event one time where I said, I think I'm the biggest provider of any government official in work supports because I increased the SNAP enrollment so dramatically in New York, and public health insurance was also quite high in New York City. Here's how these benefits that supplement or wages at the bottom work. Instead of saying to the employer who's got his own problems or her problems, of this person's wages and their livelihood, you're by yourself, and the wages you're going to pay, you're going to have to take care of their entire situation. We say all of us should share in that burden. The ITC is a way in which all Americans contribute to raising the return for work for low-income Americans. And I think that's better. I'm a big fan of getting everybody helping. And I think to say to the employer community, it's all on you to do it, is wrong. And that's, by the way, not what we've done. Because as you well know, the minimum wage has not risen, but work supports have risen dramatically. And some people on the right and they've raised living standards. And I think higher minimum wages might run the risk of not being as effective in helping the struggling Americans.
Well, I will not.
I do think that
you and I have argued about this in other contexts.
Yes. Are we going to talk about child support enforcement?
We can talk about child support. So this will be our last question. So Robert, what do you think about child support?
Well, so for the audience, this is a sort of backwater of social policy in the United States. It's not covered as much or talked about as much, especially now, and it wasn't a long time ago. It had a heyday for a while, and Maria and I worked in it then, and we were allies on most things. I think it's sad that we don't talk about ensuring that children who happen to be raised in families where the parents don't live together, that the absent parent provides assistance to the family. Whether it's often a women's issue, whether it's a woman who's being sort of mistreated by the system they should have for their children, or a children's issue, because additional financial support helps the child. It also leads to greater emotional connection, is important. One of the interesting things about this child allowance and Senator Romney's proposal was that it basically just said, we're not worried about it. We don't really, who cares where the other parent is? Because in the traditional cash welfare circumstance, someone seeking aid comes in and says, I need aid. And we say, well, can we help you get a job? Can we also talk to you about the absent parent? Where is he or and won't do that. And I just think it's a kind of saying, who cares? And I think isn't so focused on getting the government to shoulder the entire burden. And child support is about personal responsibility.
So you'll be surprised to hear that I have a slightly different perspective. And I think there's a difference between inviting and requiring. So I think one of the great advantages of the child tax credit is that a parent can receive it and doesn't lose it if an absent parent pays child support. So with past cash assistance, we've had this situation where we might provide cash assistance to, I'll just use gendered language, to a mom who's taking care of her kids. And if
to families. And the vast majority of child support payments for poor families go to families. It's a tiny fraction that goes to the government. And it's the reduction in cash welfare because of the receipt of child support is also a minor issue compared to all the other dollars that are flowing around.
I would say it's a minor issue because cash support is a minor issue.
Well, that's true.
So there's a limit to what you can take away when you aren't giving much in the first place.
It doesn't affect Medicaid eligibility. It doesn't affect SNAP eligibility. It doesn't affect the EITC.
Right.
Doesn't affect housing. Doesn't affect anything.
Robert, so one thing I would say that I find challenging is I think if we want to enforce responsibility, if we're not about punishing people or limiting choice or things like that, if we're really enforcing responsibility, so it's kind of a child rights argument about child support, then I think it shouldn't be tied to parents' income. I mean, middle-class children have rights too. But right now, we really only force, moms to identify the father of their child if for example, if their pregnancy is covered by Medicaid, right? I mean, so we tie it to income as opposed to child's rights argument.
Well, that's partly because the middle-class families aren't seeking government assistance to replace the absent. And middle-class families take advantage of the child support program quite dramatically too. I mean, one of the great tragedies of the tort system and the legal system in the United States was that women whose husbands had abandoned them, it was easier to penalize the absent parent for not paying a traffic ticket than for not paying child support. Yep. And we fixed that, Maria. We did fix that.
Well, I'll give you more credit for that, Robert, than I did. But I will give you a chance at any last words you'd like to leave us with, because as much as I would like to spend another hour arguing child support policy with you.
Yes, I agree.
I did note that it's a backwater argument. So any last words that you have for us as we kind of look towards what I think we would both agree is a period of dramatic changes in policy that we're likely to see. We've seen some, we're likely to see more. Are there questions you would suggest to the people who have joined us that we should really be asking ourselves into as we evaluate whether those programs have been a success?
Well, I think that it's, to me, remember I mentioned the measures of success are macroeconomic figures and numbers related to past trends. And so I would encourage everyone, as we evaluate the impacts or results of these policy changes, for those of you who support them, to take responsibility for them. Say, we're doing this, I'm going to make it happen. Poverty is going to go down. Work is not really going to be affected. We're not going to have an increase in single parents. More kids are going to get the benefits of two parents contributing to their lives. And our record is going to be significantly stronger than, say, it was in 2020, prior to the pandemic. Now, it happens that 2020, prior to the pandemic, we reached all-time lows for child poverty in some categories. So the standard is there. That's where we were. Some people like to say, oh, I want to get better than that. And I'm glad they do. And I hope they do. I want those numbers to get better, not worse. But if they don't, I want us to acknowledge the role that public policy played in not helping us get where we want to get. So I really appreciated being invited. I love Maria, you and Georgetown and Court Center, and Maddie was so nice to introduce me. I hope we can continue to have a dialogue, and I hope we listen to each other and talk and work together in the future. But I also, and I think we want the same outcomes. And the question is just, let's hold ourselves accountable. And what I wanted to say was this, what I was proud about, and I had certain advantages, I acknowledge. I was in New York. New York did certain things differently than other states in the wake of welfare reform. I acknowledge that. But they did them in a way that was consistent with, a work requirement in cash welfare and a strong child support enforcement. And from 1995 until now, almost, progress was made. And there was a period in fighting poverty when progress wasn't made. And that was in the 80s and early 90s. And in my opinion, we made some changes that made progress in the right direction. I just don't want us to go back to a period when things were not so good in fighting poverty. I hope you're right, Maria.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us, and thanks everybody else who joined us for the 2020 slightly delayed Whittington lecture. I really appreciate everybody's presence here, especially yours, Robert. Thank you.